Welcome to The Victory Kitchen, the podcast all about American food rationing during World War II. I'm your host, Sarah Creviston Lee, author, historian, and vintage foodie. I'll be exploring the logistics of food rationing, featuring wartime cookbooks and recipes, and highlighting real home front experiences. We're going to be learning exactly what our grandmothers had to do to get their food to fight for victory. Hello, welcome to another episode of The Victory Kitchen. I am so excited to be in front of a microphone again. Now, I'm going to let you in on a little secret. The last episode I recorded about Canada was actually recorded in January, so it's been quite a few months since I have recorded an episode, and I am so excited to be back at it. So thank you so much for joining me. Now, because the last episode was kind of a special episode, I wanted to do a really quick kind of introduction to Season 3. Now, there are 4 huge components to studying World War II. There's the government, there's military, there's the home front, and then there's agriculture. Now, all of these have some form of overlap, but they're pretty distinctive on their own. This season, I wanted to take a tiny bite out of agriculture and how it contributed to the overall rationing situation in the United States. It's important to understand the workings of agriculture at the time in order to understand why rationing was the way it was with all of its complexities. To do that, we're going to be looking at the little known and under-researched mighty American Women's Land Army. So today's episode is number 19, AWLA, 3 million women fight in the fields. Now, when people think about the Women's Land Army, they probably automatically think of the British Women's Land Army, which that is very understandable. They did amazing work during World War II, and they're kind of the iconic image that we think of. And the British Women's Land Army actually does have a little part to play, or actually kind of a bigger part to play in the grand scheme of things for the American Women's Land Army. So we're going to quickly gloss over kind of the precursor of the American Women's Land Army, like what led up to the organization it became in World War II. The American Women's Land Army started in World War I. It greatly contributed to the food effort to support the troops and the American people during the war. They planted and harvested crops. And they had their own organization. They had their own uniforms. And that actually, there's some scholarship on that. And you can find quite a bit of information about the American Women's Land Army during that time period. And then it kind of drops off into obscurity. Now, there were some international women's land armies that paved the way for the organization of the American Women's Land Army. There was Great Britain's Women's Land Army, Canada's Farmerettes, Australia's Women's Land Army, and New Zealand's Women's Land Corps and Women's Land Service. So all of these organizations, they came before and they set some good examples of what women could do and what was possible with government organization. It didn't necessarily change the minds of men in government in the United States, but it definitely showed the possibilities. Now, this episode, we're going to be answering some questions about the little-known American Women's Land Army. What was the American Women's Land Army in World War II? Were they widely accepted? Who were these women and what kind of work did they do? How did they personally benefit from their experience? And how successful were they? How important was their effort for the war? I just wanted to give a huge round of applause to Stephanie A. Carpenter for her book On the Farm Front, The Women's Land Army in World War II. I pulled a lot of the research for this episode from her book. It was just full of so much amazing information that I know would be very difficult to find anywhere else. As far as I know, this is the only book published about the American Women's Land Army. And I just have to say, shame on the World War II history scholarship community, because if we have been studying World War II for 75 years and this is the only book, I mean, really, how many books on the military are there? And there's only this one book on the Women's Land Army. We can do better than that. So I just have to say kudos to her. She did amazing work, and there is so much more work that can be done to study these amazing women and the work that they did in the fields. The American Women's Land Army has largely gone ignored, and I can say arguably our war would have turned out very differently without the contribution of these millions of women. Let's get down to our questions. What was the American Women's Land Army? The Women's Land Army was part of the Emergency Farm Labor Program. Another program under this umbrella was the Victory Farm Volunteers, which recruited high schoolers to work in the fields during their summer break. So, laying the groundwork for this program, Eleanor Roosevelt went to England to study the British Women's Land Army, to take notes for copying the organization for use in the United States. She saw how successful they were, how much good work they were doing, how much food that was being produced. And she thought, hey, this is amazing. Let's do this in the United States. So she went and did her own research. Way to go. Way to go, Eleanor. There were also suggestions and pressure coming from the national media about reinstating the Women's Land Army from World War I. So things like from the newspapers suggesting, hey, why don't we bring back this Women's Land Army? Also, women's magazines, Life magazine, I think, was also suggesting things like this. People were having these ideas like, hey, the women did it back then. Like, why not do it now? There was also this really great organization started by Dorothy Thompson. It was called the Vermont Volunteer Land Corps. Dorothy Thompson was a newspaper columnist and radio personality. In this program, she successfully used non-farm labor on farms in Vermont in 1942. This experiment used urban youths to work on farms, and it was her hope to demonstrate the program in other states around the country. In New York, there was a Farm for Freedom program that had mixed success. Some farmers were so reluctant to use female labor in their fields that they preferred to let their fruits and vegetables rot in the fields. But in the Hudson Valley, the farmers accepted the women's help and had good success getting their crops in. What's unique about this area of the country is that Chinese nationals who were previously farmers before emigrating were highly sought after and were paid better and received free living quarters as opposed to inexperienced white college women doing the same work. California was another state that used female labor before the Women's Land Army. With the removal of the Japanese labor force into imprisonment camps and with year-round crops to harvest, California did not waste any time on qualms about gender or where they were from an urban or farming background. They didn't care. This was the case up and down the West Coast from Oregon and Washington as well. Non-farm women participated in harvesting crops long before the formation of the Women's Land Army. So it just depended on where in the country, there were women working in the fields, but this was mostly on the coasts. They, were a little more forward thinking. It was mostly the middle, like the Mountain West, Southwest, the Midwest, and the South. That's where it was a little bit more complicated, and farmers had a little bit harder time accepting the idea of women in the fields. Now we're going to get to the government. Secretary Wickard was one key administrator in the U.S. Department of Agriculture, who was a huge opponent to the idea of women, mostly urban middle-class white women, in the fields. And despite recommendations from other government committees, Eleanor Roosevelt and the growing concern of farmers for the need for more labor in 1941 and 1942, the idea of using women as a solution to the problem was shoveled around and not given to any one department to take charge of. Then by 1943, after a lot of dragging their feet and the war food situation getting really pressing, the government finally did something about it. Much of the male labor was enlisting, and while many states drew from a small labor pool of soldiers on deferment, Mexican nationals, prisoners of war, and conscientious objectors, it was not nearly enough labor for planting, harvesting, processing, and bringing to market the crops that the government was asking of the farmers. So they finally gave in and formed the Women's Land Army. Yippee! 1943. So the U.S. Crop Corps was formed, and while it operated as its own identity, the Women's Land Army operated under its umbrella. So I wanted to read this little article from the Lyon County Farm Bureau News from June 1943. This is a little thumbnail sketch of the U.S. Crop Corps, because when I was doing research, I got really confused about all these different organizations. There was like the Victory Farm Volunteers and the Women's Land Army and the U.S. Crop Corps. I'm like, what are all these things? Like, what do they all mean? So I thought this sketch in this article made it a lot more clear. It says, the U.S. Crop Corps is the national term used to identify all workers on the farm or in food processing plants. Farm workers in the U.S. Crop Corps will include men, women, boys, and girls who work full-time or part-time during seasonal or emergency harvest periods who are not considered as members of the farm family unit, whether they are skilled, semi-skilled, or untrained volunteers, whether they are residents of this country or imported from nearby foreign countries. Youths volunteering for farm work in the U.S. Crop Corps will be called Victory Farm Volunteers, which is also affiliated with the High School Victory Corps sponsored by the Office of Education. Women who work full-time or during seasonal periods of not less than 1 month will be members of the Women's Land Army of the U.S. Crop Corps. Other workers not qualifying for these two groups will be known simply as U.S. Crop Corps workers. Yeah, so in a nutshell, that explains everything. And thank you, whoever wrote that, for clarifying that for me. So on February 17th, 1943, under the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Extension Service gained jurisdiction over the Emergency Labor Program. The USDA would be in charge of recruiting, placing, and training agricultural workers for the nation's farms, and the Extension Service would be in charge of the labor forces. So as part of the Emergency Farm Labor Program, the Women's Land Army would recruit, hire, and place women on farms for the remainder of the war. So in this first year, they thought they'd have about 10,000 women for year-round labor and about 50,000 women for seasonal work. Then another 300,000 for short-term emergency work. The Extension Service learned quickly that they'd need more labor than that to sustain the country. And in actuality, the participation of women in the Women's Land Army was 10 times their initial estimates. I bet that kind of blew them away. The creation of the Women's Land Army at first was just a token gesture, however. Surprise, surprise. When addressing the House and Senate subcommittees on appropriations about funding for the Emergency Farm Labor Program, Secretary Wickard suggested addressing labor problems by focusing efforts on granting military deferments, importing Mexican nationals, transporting African Americans from one area to another, and when necessary, employing women. Women were last on his list, signaling the common feeling of the time that non-farm white women didn't belong in the fields and that getting them there wasn't a priority. Then along came Florence L. Hall. The USDA appointed her to be the head of the Women's Land Army. She was a proven extension leader, having been an extension home economist from 1928 to 1943, and she'd worked for the USDA's Dairy Bureau. She was perfect for the job. She immediately took charge of building the administrative structure that would make the Women's Land Army a smooth, well-oiled machine as the years went on. She organized the marketing and propaganda and worked hard on getting the word out to women about this opportunity of serving their country. Not only that, but she had a huge job ahead of her educating the farmers on how much women could help them on their farms and cutting through a great deal of heated prejudice. So just looking at the tasks ahead of her, I don't think just anyone could have done this job. She had to be a force of nature and just not take no for an answer. And she did amazing. And she did it all. Like she did it, as we shall see. So now I want to get into the nitty gritty, because I always want to know the nitty gritty, because it's one thing to know about something, but if I wanted to join the Women's Land Army, like, how do you go about doing it? Like, what are the qualifications? So to become a member of the Women's Land Army, to apply, they had to fill out an application blank available at their nearest U.S. Office of Employment or county agricultural agent, the American Women's Voluntary Services, and other designated services. And I found out this information from a newspaper article in the Courier-Journal from Kentucky in April 1943. It also said for the qualifications, the woman has to be 18 years of age, physically fit. Early on, a doctor's certificate stating she was fit for hard farm work was required. But later on, because they just really wanted to get women in the fields, this was waived. She needed to understand that the work was long and hard. This is something that Florence Hall really wanted the women to understand. It's not a vacation, even though at first it was kind of advertised like, oh, take your vacation on a farm, do some farm work for your country. But yeah, it's long and hard work. That's what they needed to understand. And in one newspaper article, Hall was quoted as saying, "Women recruits must realize that the farm day begins at dawn and ends when the day's tasks are done." Hall also cited a list of attributes that were desirable. Quote, dexterity, speed, accuracy, patient, interest, curiosity, rivalry, and patriotism, close quote. Now, I wanted to talk about the uniform because this was how they were recognizable. And if we look at posters of other women's land armies from around the world, they all are pretty distinct. And the American Women's Land Army is no exception. The uniform wasn't just important for identification and unity as a part of a national organization, though. It was important for safety. A lot of the women they were recruiting from urban areas were coming to work on farms for the very first time. And so whether because of ignorance or women just wearing their everyday clothes to do farm work, they sometimes got into accidents by catching their clothes and machinery. So having a safe and durable uniform for the women to wear was really important to the U.S. Department of Agriculture. They published this statement. Farm work calls for wearing clothing as nearly fitted for the job as possible. Because of the ease with which they're always catching in something, floppy, loose-fitting clothes are out of order. Women particularly must be careful on this score. House dresses aren't as suitable for most types of farm work as special work slacks or coveralls. It is important that you wear a suitable hat or other head covering as protection against the sun. Wear comfortable low-heeled shoes. Open-toed shoes aren't suitable for women doing farm work. Neither is jewelry. That caution also applies to men in the habit of wearing rings. This quote came from Stephanie Carpenter's book on the farm front. So with this safety in mind, the USDA tasked the creation of a Women's Land Army uniform to the Bureau of Home Economics and Extension. Clothing specialists from Maryland, New York, and Wisconsin, they designed the Women's Land Army uniform, which they described as a quote-unquote comfortable, sloppy, but swagger blue denim uniform. This description was not very attractive to women at the time. I think it's really funny. But I found a much better description of the uniform because, once again, I am all about the nitty-gritty details. So this description of the Women's Land Army uniform comes from the Houston Herald, from this really cool article that's a Q&A that has all these question and answers about the Women's Land Army. It's from 17th of January, 1943. It described the uniform like this. Quote, women accepted for the Women's Land Army may, if they desire, wear the regulation blue uniform of cotton denim, a light blue shirt, dark blue overalls and bib and shoulder straps, and a dark blue jacket for cool mornings. The trousers are made to hang free or fasten tight at the ankle for safety in working with machinery. The cap is of light and dark blue denim, bearing the Women's Land Army insignia, with a visor to protect the eyes from glaring sun. A dark blue skirt for streetwear completes the uniform, which is all washable. The women of the Land Army buy their own uniforms at a nominal cost. Close quote. So the one thing that stands out to me is that the trousers, that you're able to fasten them tight at the ankle for safety, working around the machinery. That's really important for the safety aspects, because even like loose hanging trouser legs can catch a machinery. So yeah, it's a really clever uniform. Now, the dark blue skirt, this is the only reference that I've seen that they have a skirt part of the uniform for streetwear. I've never seen pictures of this, but I'm very interested to see if this is true. I have found a reference in the National Archives catalog for the uniform and insignias of the Women's Land Army. It's a textual record. I would have to go down and look at it myself. I feel very, very blessed to live just an hour and a half away from the archives. So if I'm lucky, I don't even know if they're open right now, but if I'm lucky, I'll be able to get down there and take a look. And maybe we can solve this mystery of the skirt. That would be so cool if they did have a skirt as part of their uniform too. Now, the overalls and cap had the Women's Land Army insignia. So the Women's Land Army insignia consisted of the WLA and the crop core C, which was on the inside, looks like a gear. And then there's a shock of wheat at the center of the C. So that's the crop core insignia as well. It's kind of a cool patch that they had on their uniforms. So it said that the women could buy their uniforms at a nominal cost. Well, that's all relative, I guess. All except the jacket was required for 1943 and could be purchased for $6.20. So as a member of the Women's Land Army and to be recognized as such, you needed to have that 3-piece uniform, which I'm guessing is the like the overalls, the shirt, and the hat. The jacket cost $2.50 and a second shirt cost $1.35. For $10.05, a woman could purchase a complete uniform. This was a problem, though, when most women working in the Women's Land Army could barely afford anything above their room and board because the pay was so small. And we'll be talking about that in just a minute. As a result, most members made do with their own clothing, with things like overalls, pants, cotton shirts, straw hats, and low-heeled durable shoes. By 1944, the uniform price had been reduced to $7.65, with the 3-piece set costing only $4.70, which was more affordable. So by that time, hopefully more women were able to purchase the uniform. Now, when it comes to pay, 30 cents an hour was set by the Women's Bureau and Department of Labor in 1942 and ratified in February of 1943 by the Department of Labor. Of course, this was more complicated across the country. Not everyone was paid by the hour. Some people were paid by the piece, by the week, by the month. And then there were already set wages paid to agricultural workers varying by region. Being paid by the piece was great for more experienced workers who could work faster and more efficiently, but it wasn't a good rate of pay for less experienced workers. And then besides that, there was the cost of living for the different areas of the country. So, like, for example, workers in the Northeast could barely pay their room and board from what they were getting as women's land army workers. But despite this, women still signed up, which is testament to the fact that many women weren't in it for the money, but for their patriotism in doing their part for the war. I think that says a lot about these women. Now, housing was another aspect of being a member of the Women's Land Army. You were provided with housing while working. With the huge, unexpected numbers of women joining, there was a shortage of housing. Surprise. But communities did the best that they could. Women Land Army members traveled around the country as well. So if one area had a surplus of labor, they'd be sent to an area that had a greater need. There were different types of housing. There's living with the farm family themselves. But this kind of brought in some of those fears, especially in the Midwest. There was these fears that urban women would be corrupting the families and the menfolk with their worldly, immoral ways. As far as I know, none of which came to fruition. Private homes in the community were another other place that they were housed. Vacant schools, dormitories, community facilities, country clubs, sometimes temporary lodgings were built. Then there were work camps that housed thousands of workers in New York and California and Michigan and other areas around the country. Some areas where they established camps were an American Legion Hall along Allegan Lake in Michigan, a high school gymnasium, a fraternity house, college dormitories, and a private school. So these are just examples of where they set up camps, work camps for these huge amounts of workers. Then there was the aspect of safety. Many women coming into the Women's Land Army were farm women or had some farm experience, but most had no farming experience at all. So members were required to sign a farm safety pledge as a way to indicate their seriousness towards safety on the job. This was the USDA's way of protecting itself and hopefully signaling to the participant that farming had a lot of hazards and they had to be on their toes at all times. So in Carpenter's book on the farm front, she has the farm pledge, which I thought was really interesting to read. It says, "In performing my patriotic duties as a member of the U.S. Crop Corps, I pledge to do my work on the farm in the way safest to myself, to my fellow workers, and to the livestock and equipment I use. I will recognize that farm work represents the learning of a large number of separate skills. I will ask the farmer how to do my job, to demonstrate the exact procedure to me, and then I will do it immediately under his supervision. I will ask him to inspect my work regularly to be sure I am doing it properly and safely. I recognize that it is particularly important that I receive proper instruction in the handling of livestock and equipment. I will familiarize myself with the rules of safe tractor and equipment operation. I will safeguard children. I will be on the lookout for accident hazards and help to remove them. I will not smoke in the barn, around gasoline, or in ripe grain or hay fields. I know that serious injuries result from horseplay, quote-unquote fooling, and so-called practical jokes, so I will not indulge in these forms of amusement." There is a lot going on in this pledge, but it really indicates that there was a lot that could go wrong on a farm, and so I think this is a really illuminating document to study now for us to understand, the pledge that they had to sign, just so that they were aware of the hazards that they were getting themselves into as members of the Women's Land Army. The USDA also issued special insurance for the Women's Land Army members against serious injury or loss of life that could be purchased for 1 to 3 month terms. And even though a large number of insurance companies carried the insurance, almost no Women's Land Army members purchased them, which is highly suspected due to the cost. They just couldn't afford it. And now it's hard to know how many were injured through any insurance claims just because there aren't any records. So were these women widely accepted? Some areas of the country, like California, had no problems with women working in the fields. In general, the common thinking around the country was that women didn't belong in the fields. Farm women weren't counted in this because they were considered on-site emergency labor anyway, but they weren't considered a permanent solution either. So early on in the war in the Midwest, the early feelings of the farmers was that there was no way they would let middle-class white urban women into their fields or on their farms. They would corrupt their families and menfolk with their immoral city ways. In the South, though, it was more about race and social class. They didn't have a problem with poor whites or black women on their farms because that was the way it had already been with sharecropping. But they were strongly against letting urban white middle class women onto their farms to help because that was quote unquote against the way of things. In states like North Carolina, Virginia, and Georgia, it was extremely difficult to even establish women's land army chapters due to these prejudices. And when they did, Black women were barred from becoming members. So the chapters would place Black women on farms, but they would not even let them join the Women's Land Army. However, in Mississippi, they welcomed them all, and they had a very robust Women's Land Army program. So as a national organization, Florence Hall and the Women's Land Army, they wanted all women to join in and to help harvest the nation's crops. But what was just disheartening for them and for us from today's perspective is to see how individual states kind of grappled with the race and gender issues that they had at that time, and the unfairness that we see as they dealt with these problems. Even though many African American women were barred from membership in the Women's Land Army, their hard work for the war effort definitely cannot be discounted. While in my research, I didn't come across any other information about other minority groups, I'm sure that there are other groups of women in the Women's Land Army that haven't been studied yet. And I hope that over time, we'll be able to learn about these women and to see and to hear their stories. In my research, I did find some images of African American women wearing the Women's Land Army uniform in pictures from the National Archives. And I will have these pictures among many others that you'll be able to access on my blog. What's interesting is that next to farmers, the biggest group of people unsure about urban women on the farm were farm wives themselves. They weren't sure if city women could keep up, or they were worried they'd think a week out in the country would be a vacation and they'd slack off. There was an article in the July 1942 Farm Journal and Farmer's Wife magazine entitled, "Can Town and City Women Help?" And this came out when there was, the rumors going around that there would be a Women's Land Army. And they were asking farm women, do you think that city women could help you? Is this something that's even worth thinking about? And the farm women in general were saying, I think town women could help us with the odd jobs around the house, like helping with canning, helping care for kids, weeding in the garden. In fact, most of even the older women from town could help. And when they say from town, I think they mean their own towns. They live out in the country, and then the women from town that they're familiar with could definitely come and help them. But the other women that they're talking about that they don't think could help them were the city women. The women in urban areas that have no familiarity with farm life or what it takes to get things done on a farm. Those were the women that they had huge reservations about. In this paragraph, it says, others doubt that their sisters can take it, quote unquote, take it. Some of them seem to regard all city women as glamour girls who detest to get their hands soiled or the polish off their nails or a curl out of place. Whereas one woman pointed out, there's no glamour about slopping hogs or cleaning a brooder house. City girls would be soft-muscled and couldn't stand the summer heat, thinks Mrs. James Richards of Michigan. Mrs. Paul Smith, living on a big North Dakota farm, points out that some city women apparently don't know that 5 a.m. is on the clock, and as that they are eternally bathing and using hot water. Despite all this, she believes that some of them would be capable enough and that they could help with certain jobs, chiefly canning. Pictures of pretty young things attired in clever work togs and draped over the wheel of a tractor, even though they may not know which is the front end of the thing, apparently have burned up many a farm woman. We can use real helpers, says Mrs. Walter Schneis, Wisconsin, but not the fashion page variety who dress in their little uniforms and sit around waiting to be admired. An Ohio woman introduces another note when she observes that some of these girls could help if they would do anything besides lie about in brief sunsuits and roll their eyes at the farmers. But she thinks that just having such competition around would take more nerve control than already harassed, hardworking farm women could stand. Mrs. George Hanst in Western Maryland votes against city women's help. Since we are thinking in terms of production instead of social contacts, inevitably she thinks the city woman would have the status of a guest, leading to more thought over menus, table appointments, etc. than farm women have time for now. So you can see that there was quite a lot of heated feelings about women from the city, and also maybe some misconceptions about women from the city. And you know what? These images that they're talking about, these maybe misconceptions, maybe not. I have seen images of these very women that they're talking about in advertisements. There's a Woodbury soap advertisement of a girl on a tractor with her hands up by her head, looking glamorous and beautiful. And she's talking about her Woodbury soap routine. And it doesn't really look like she knows what she's doing on that tractor. She's just looking glamorous. But this was a very common in advertisements. And this was the very image that the Women's Land Army was fighting against. These images did them absolutely no favors. And as we can see, it was working against them, even with the very farm women that they were trying to help. These farm women were not joking around. They're like, we cannot use women like this. We don't want them. They're not helpful. They're just going to sit mooning around at the menfolk while they're making more work for us. So these were real concerns that these women had about these urban women. Now, is this what happened? Maybe. Maybe in some cases it did. But I think when it came down to it, I don't think in the majority that is what happened. I think when urban women signed up for the Women's Land Army, they got down to business and they saw for themselves what hard work it was, and they wanted to do work for their country, and they did it. So to fight these misconceptions, these prejudices, the Women's Land Army and Florence Hall in particular, she spearheaded these promotional and propaganda campaigns to educate people about the program. So she had educational promotional materials, including articles and pamphlets and reports. There were movies and film strips. There were weekly ads in the newspaper, and there was radio publicity. There were feature stories in the national and popular presses, as well as weekly radio programs. All of these assisted in promoting the Women's Land Army. There were also some recruitment kits, and I found these really fascinating. And on the farm front, Stephanie Carpenter talks about these recruitment kits. She says, each year of Women's Land Army operation, the Extension Service gathered brochures and other materials to form recruitment kits for state and county organizations with examples of radio and media spots, presentations that could be adapted to any county, area, or state in the nation. Short spots quickly described the farm labor situation, provided the location for recruitment, and suggested that all women in sound health should consider their part in the war effort. Longer radio spots of 3 minutes included an interview with a county agent. These scripted radio spots passed along information that described the number of laborers needed, the location of work, and the amount of time needed for the job. I don't have time to read the radio script like I want to, but I will have a copy of it on my blog for you to read, because I just want you to get a good idea of how clever this little radio bit is and how adaptable it was for anywhere in the country for them to advertise what type of labor that they needed for their area. this was a really clever way to get the Women's Land Army labor out there to facilitate the needs of the different areas of the country and to make it easy for them to get the help that they needed. Now, who were these women and what kind of work did they do in the Women's Land Army? The women came from all backgrounds. There were farm women, town women, city women, college girls on summer break, teachers, homemakers, office workers. And as time went on, the Women's Land Army just asked for any women, even those already working jobs, to dedicate any extra time they had on the weekends or at the ends of their shifts to help on their local farms. When joining the Women's Land Army, there was a training period. The amount of training varied depending on the amount of time you were dedicated from either a summer or as year-round help. So year-round help received 2-week training, usually at a college of agriculture or university extension or similar. There were tractor training programs, nicknamed tractorette programs, and other training programs offered by land grant, colleges, and extension agents. That same Q&A article in the Houston Herald also explained what kind of work women would be doing. It says, quote, "The year-round workers will probably find work on dairy, poultry, truck, or fruit farms where the need for labor is very acute. The women will feed the livestock, weigh and measure food, wash dairy utensils, candle and pack eggs, and many other routine tasks. Truck farms use a great deal of hand labor, and some large farms have already asked for Land Army women to plant, weed, spray, harvest, grade, and pack produce, and to do the many other jobs which have to be done on such farms. Seasonal workers will do more of the planting, hoeing, or harvesting jobs when extra help is needed for a short time," close quote. That was kind of an estimation of what workers would be doing, because this was at the beginning of the formation of the Women's Land Army. But after the fact, just going through Stephanie Carpenter's book, and she was listing all the different types of jobs that women did in all the different areas of the country. They did things like planting, cultivating, harvesting fruit and vegetables. They sorted, packed, and graded produce like peaches. That's just one crop. Worked on dairy farms and milking and caring for dairy cows. They did milk delivery and milk testing. They worked on poultry farms. They cared for livestock. They harvested hay, detasseled corn, picked cotton, harvested tobacco, stacked peanuts. They drove combines, tractors, and trucks. I mean, that is just a very small sampling. They did so many farm jobs. As the war progressed and the Women's Land Army became even more streamlined, for the larger Women's Land Army work crews, there were even in some cases lunch wagons and women to cook for them. They even had carpools to work sites and better housing situations. So each year, the Women's Land Army improved and got better. So how did these women benefit personally from their experience? Some college girls were so impacted by their summer farm experience that they not only went back to school and recruited friends for the next summer, but they changed their course of study to agricultural studies. On the Farm Front gives an example of a woman who returned to Smith College and became so interested in rural problems after her 1942 summer working on a Vermont farm that she changed her college course and majored in rural economics. She also shares a story of a woman named Sarah Calvin. She relates, Sarah Calvin, a student at Columbia College, joined the Women's Land Army to harvest peaches in 1944. Sarah and 2 friends, as reported in the 1944 annual report, did outstanding work in the packing shed at the Fernwood Farm. Her employer said that she did the best inspecting job of any person he had ever employed. He gave her a $50 bonus at the end of the season. Sarah herself enjoyed the experience and realized the importance that women's work brought to the war effort. I would not have been happy had I not done this work or something like it. I thoroughly enjoyed my work. We had long hours to work, but I was glad of that because it made me feel like I was helping the war effort that much more. I'm willing to assist next year. If I don't get to help with the actual peach harvest, I shall be glad to help with the recruitment program. In 1945, Calvin assisted with state Women's Land Army recruitment. So there are countless stories like these where the women just loved their work. It wasn't just something new or a novel experience. They, especially the urban women getting out into the country breathing this fresh air, working in the soil. They loved that experience, and they just wanted to come back for more. They also loved being able to work for their country. They felt like they were actually doing something tangible. They could see the fruits of their labors, literally, and they knew that they were doing something to feed the troops, to feed their country. And they were really helping these farmers, because if it wasn't for them and their efforts, a lot of crops would have rotted in the fields. That was a real important effort. So most feedback about their experience in the Women's Land Army was positive. There were some negative things, but for the most part, they had a positive experience in the Women's Land Army. So how successful were they, and how important was their effort for the war? Everywhere they worked, the women surpassed expectations and changed the way farmers thought about women workers on their farms. In Mississippi, a state report said, quote, "The present farm labor shortage has changed materially all past procedures, customs, and thinking of farm people. There is a decided difference in the types of work women are doing. Practically every county has expressed pride in the contribution women are making. Women laborers are found to be dependable, require little supervision, given to punctuality and details, work systematically and with little or no confusion, all of which tend to please the fancy of the farmer." This is from On the Farm Front, too. She also talks about in her book just these different reactions of the farmers to these women, kind of like shock or surprise that they are so happy with the work of these women, where they were so suspicious before. But they said things like, these women found dirt in the dairy room that no man would have found. The women wouldn't get drunk and smash up the farm machinery. And, they handled the chicks more gently than the men did. And they got more milk out of the cows because they treated them more gently. Just that women were more careful and more detail-oriented and just really dedicated workers. I don't know. And so it was just, there was a lot of positive feedback from the farmers that they were very enthusiastic and said they would hire them back, next crop season. And even some farmers saying that they would invite them, even after the war, they would hire women workers after the war. And you see this reflected in, the war industry and factories, and, just this astonishment that women are actually good at something. Of course they are. It's no surprise to women. But it was a chance for women to show men that, yeah, they are very adaptable. They can do amazing things, and farm work was no exception. And I definitely didn't want this to be a feminist tirade against men or anything like that. It's just really cool to see the pride in the work of the women from the farmers' mouths themselves. And this is more about men who have always just hired men in the fields, and when that option's not available, they are turning to this other labor source that they'd never thought of before or thought it was even a thing. And they're discovering, oh, wait, actually, they are great. And, and it's good to see this shift in mindset. And it actually impacted, women and agriculture, for a long time. Women's Land Army workers knew the value of their labor. On the Farm Front, one woman said, "No matter how heavy the hay we pitched, how our backs ached from weeding, or how stubborn the team we were driving, we always had this secret joy that we were helping the war effort." Another woman said, "The girls went home in better physical condition, feeling that they had had a paid vacation. They felt they had really played a part in a war emergency program. And even on VJ Day, the women went to work while others celebrated. These girls felt they must get to the field and get the beans before they got too old." I love that even on VJ Day, when everyone is out celebrating, they're like, nope, we got to get those beans. Way to go. Stephanie Carpenter says, Though short-lived, the Women's Land Army was a catalyst for changing women's positions in agriculture and society for later decades. The placement of millions of American women on farms during World War II ensured the continuation of this practice after the end of the war. So while the Women's Land Army was hugely successful, most farmers went back to hiring men after the war as they came home from the military, though some did keep women hired on. But something interesting that Stephanie Carpenter points out in her book is that men didn't stay on those farms. They were disappointed with the low pay, left those farm jobs for higher paying jobs, and women went back to those farm jobs in higher numbers. So the Women's Land Army definitely had a lasting impact on women's roles in agriculture that we can still feel today. During its operation, the Women's Land Army oversaw 3 million women who planted, cultivated, and harvested crops and cared for livestock on American farms. That is not a number to be sneezed at. 3 million women. That is way more than they ever imagined would be working on these farms. They kept crops from rotting the fields and on the trees. They helped feed American troops and citizens and our allies. The work of farm and non-farm women during World War II cannot go underestimated. And even though their image isn't quite as iconic as Rosie the Riveter, it's about time they got to share her limelight because they did just as much in service of their country and in doing their part for the war effort. There will be no victory flights for these women. Most of their efforts will still largely go unnoticed in society and in history books. But I hope by talking about it today and through the fantastic work by historians like Stephanie Carpenter, we can give them more credit and thank them for the awesome kick-butt service that they deserve. Today's cookbook feature is The Coupon Cookery by Prudence Penny. It also has a subtitle. It says, The New Book of Ration Revised Recipes and Menus, including a handy changeable table of point values for all foods. This was a book that was published in 1943. It was published by Hearst Publications. Prudence Penny was a column in a newspaper that usually offered recipes and tips for the kitchen. She was a nationally famous home economist, dietitian, and nutrition expert. And I haven't done a lot of research on Prudence Penny, but I have come across her column. I think she's related to like Hearst newspapers, which is why it's a Hearst publication. But on the inside jacket, it says, when ration books broke upon a troubled world and housewives began to be told what they could buy to eat and how much of it they could buy and when they could buy it, thousands of cookbooks went out of date for the duration. Oh, this is not to gainsay their value, but they were built upon the premise that what their recipes required you could obtain if you had the money, and that if you did not have the money, it was only necessary to turn to a simpler, more proletarian dish. Now all this has changed. Rationing poses many culinary problems, not the least of which is sound nutrition plus appetite appeal within the bounds of Uncle Sam's allowance. Prudence Penny, one of the best-known names in American cookery, foresaw many of these problems arising. She has accordingly sat in conference with famous nutritional experts, tested menus with typical families, devised ways and means of overcoming the difficulties of ration cookery, discovered weak spots and corrected them, until today her advice is eagerly sought by thousands of homemakers throughout the nation. In preparing Prudence Penny's pointers for ration cookery, the author has attempted nothing more than to make this an easy-to-understand, easy-to-follow cookery help until we are back to the good old days again, and you may buy whatever you like and eat as much of whatever you please within the limitations of what is good for you. Prudence here takes you through the trials of shopping, of budgeting your points, of getting the most and the best for the least. She remembers that you'd like to entertain occasionally, that perhaps your club might face the task of feeding 50 people, that your husband is finicky about his lunch. No matter how dazed you may have been, facing 3 square meals a day to prepare, your ration book reaching the vanishing point, this volume will help you whether you live alone or cook for a large family. Prudence Penny's pointers for ration cookery ought to be on the kitchen bookshelf of every woman who regards food as something more than the factor that keeps us alive. It's an investment that will pay for itself many times over in money, time, patience, nutrition, value, and good meals. Wow. This cookbook promises everything. Um, just reading that makes me want to run out and buy it. Doesn't it make you want to do that? And that's the great thing about a good inner flap description. So this cookbook promises to do a lot. And I have, and what's unique about this is its chart. And I'm very disappointed that whoever owned this book before me in wartime never filled out the chart. Why didn't they? And I'll have images of this on my blog with the chart. It's got the foods in a list on the left-hand side of the page, and then it's got the points value in several columns, and then the price on the right, and then the brand. And so you can keep track as the points change for these different things that you buy. It's got quite a few columns for you to track that. So that's really cool. It also has a record of coupon expiration dates. So smart. Tells you how to shop with ration stamps. So as a book studying how the ration system worked, this is actually a really handy research guide. It's got menus, it's got market orders for the menus. And then what also makes this cookbook really unique is the illustrations. The illustrations are lots of fun. For each chapter, it's got one at the beginning, and then it's got a little poem that goes with each one. So for chapter 5, Plenty of Bread and Cereals, it shows a woman juggling an overflowing bag of breads, and cornflakes and things are all falling onto the ground. And the poem says, "The cook who bakes her bread and rolls is everybody's pal. Just that tantalizing fragrance will help to build morale. America is rich in grain, and grain is rich in health. Whole grain bread and cereals may prove our nation's wealth." That's actually quite a clever poem. I'm very impressed. So yeah, this, oh my goodness gracious. So I just turned to chapter 6, Meeting the Meat Problem. And it shows the housewife kneeling on the kitchen floor with a cleaver hidden behind her back, and she's beckoning to her house cat, who has an exclamation mark above his head. Yes, this is very surprising. So yeah, I guess no animal was safe in wartime. Oh my goodness. So yes, a lot of these illustrations are very tongue-in-cheek, and there's quite a few iconic ones in here. Yeah, you gotta see these. I'll have some pictures of the good ones on my blog, and that are definitely worth seeing. So the recipes that I tried are, I tried two, because don't I always try to. The first one I tried were the carrot rolls. Why make regular rolls when you can make carrot rolls? And I think I had everyone's mouths watering on Instagram. I had a very tantalizing video on there, on my reels, but these were so delicious, despite my son thinking I'd ruin them by putting carrot shreds in there. But if you're going to need to eat your vitamin A, this is definitely the way to do it. It's really just a basic roll recipe, and it's got, your 4 cups of flour, warm water. It calls for a yeast cake, but that's very simple to just replace the yeast cake with a packet of yeast, or what I usually do is just 2.5 teaspoons because I use loose yeast. Your 4 tablespoons of sugar and melted shortening, a beaten egg, salt, and 1 cup of finely grated carrots. So this is an enriched dough because it's got the egg and the fat in there. So you sift the dry ingredients, add the warm water, the softened yeast, together with the melted shortening. You mix that thoroughly, but you knead it lightly. I always forget this. You don't knead rolls like you do bread. You definitely want to knead it lightly because you want your rolls to be soft and fluffy. Then you add the grated carrot and the well-beaten egg. This is a very strange way to go about it because, I don't know, you're adding more moisture after the fact. So, I don't know. I think I did do it this way. Then you place it in a well-greased bowl and cover it and allow it to stand in the refrigerator until ready to use. But I was going to make them right away, so I just let it rise. Then you let it stand until the dough warms to room temperature if you had it in the fridge, but you let it rise till double in bulk. Then you knead it very lightly, roll it to a 1/2-inch thickness, then you cut them into squares. And then it says allow to rise again. So what I ended up doing, because I took my little squares that I cut and then I tucked the edges into the middle. I just tucked them, kept doing that until it was like a nice round ball. And then I put them into a greased pan and let them rise. And you want to do that because you want the tops to be kind of tight so that it will rise nicely. Otherwise, it will be a sloppy, not a very nice roll. Then you bake them at 425 until golden brown for 20 minutes. And they are so delicious. And I added the extra luxury of smearing on some melted butter when they were done. So, or you can do margarine if you want to do it the wartime way. They were very delicious, and we did all kinds of fun things with these rolls as a family. We even made these hot ham sandwiches, not a wartime recipe, but like modified one of those Hawaiian roll recipes. And they were so good. They worked really well for that modern recipe. So, I mean, you can use them for anything. They are super delicious. I forgot to mention before, I was trying to focus on, vegetable recipes just because I wanted to pay tribute to the Women's Land Army and, working in the fields and harvesting vegetable crops. So I wanted to focus on these vegetable recipes. So the carrot rolls was the first one. The second recipe was supreme red cabbage. And this one kind of caught my eye because of the interesting seasonings. I really like red cabbage, and this is a cooked red cabbage recipe. It uses 4 cups sliced red cabbage. You cook it covered with all these other ingredients. So 2 tablespoons oil or butter, 1/2 teaspoon salt, a tablespoon of grated onion, 2 tablespoons of water, then a few grains of nutmeg, few grains of cayenne, 2 tablespoons vinegar, and brown sugar. So the vinegar and brown sugar you don't add quite yet. You cook the red cabbage with all those other things. Once the cabbage is tender, then you add the vinegar and brown sugar. And you can add caraway seeds for some extra variation. And this is such a delicious dish. You don't want to add too much nutmeg because it can be a bit overpowering, but just a little bit, and that cayenne adds a really interesting kick. So such an interesting dish and really super delicious. I think it would be a really great side dish for a potluck or anything, really. It was yummy. So these are the 2 recipes I tried. I will have these up on my blog for you to try as well, along with images of this fantastic cookbook. Today's story highlight comes from the August 1944 issue of the Farm Journal and Farmer's Wife magazine. There is a really interesting article in here called Hearty Meals for Harvesters. And I've been holding on to this article for a really long time. When I found it, I can't remember when I bought this magazine, but it had a really special section about the Women's Land Army. And I was like, oh my gosh, I've never seen this before. And so I held on to it, just trying to remember it for later. And the article is written by Miriam Williams. It says, feeding harvesters is not a new job to most farm women, but perhaps the people you feed in 1944 will be different. If town folks come out to help, or you have members of the Women's Land Army, you'll wonder, are they fussy eaters demanding special dishes? Here are some of the answers obtained from first-hand information. Even if your harvest helpers are members of your own or the neighbor's family, as usual, you'll be interested in menus and new recipes. An especially interesting case of feeding town helpers is that of Mrs. Paul E. Brown of Fairfax County, Virginia, shown above in her own home, who has probably the most unusual collection of city helpers in the country. Some diplomatic folks in Washington, D.C. were organized under Baroness Stachelberg, American-born wife of a titled Estonian, into a Sunday on the Soil volunteer group. Sunday is their only day off, and many go after church. They give 5 hours of honest work, and their only pay is a mighty good dinner. They all say, "We love to go to the Browns." I could understand that it was not only the food which excited enthusiastic comments when I met the attractive Brown family and saw their gracious home built on true Southern lines, but doubtless it was the whopping big dish of chicken pie and the platters of just picked golden corn and the salad bowl heaped high with everything fresh and good from the garden that really made them eager for repeat trips. As reported in the article on the preceding page, 800,000 town and city women, including the Women's Land Army, will be needed on farms this year. What they like to eat is a matter of record. Last year, several groups were successfully housed and fed at an average cost of $10 per week. At Lambertville, New Jersey, for example, the girls left camp each morning in a truck, carrying their lunch in a paper sack, but breakfast and evening dinner were really substantial. The menus and recipes which follow come from several sources, but all have been tried and found successful. The menus from Mrs. Alex Quaid of Columbia County, Wisconsin, were served to silo fillers, haying crews, and corn huskers. Formerly, they were all men, but now, she says, we have boys and old men, children and teenage girls. Notice that menus follow a good rule. Serve few dishes, but have plenty of everything. So then it goes on to have a menu, Mrs. Quaid's Harvest Dinner, Harvest Supper, and then it has Women's Land Army menus. So that's what I really wanted to quote to you. And I will have the picture of this article on my blog for you to see the whole thing, including all the recipes. The Women's Land Army menus. Monday, breakfast is fruit juice, assorted cereals, potato cakes, broiled bacon, toast, jelly, coffee, or milk. Dinner is baked stuffed peppers, fresh lima beans, broiled tomatoes, vegetable salad marinated in French dressing, deep dish apple pie with cheese, tea, or milk. Tuesday, breakfast is stewed fresh plums, Rice Krispies, French toast, maple syrup, coffee, or milk. Dinner is baked chicken pie, cooked new spinach, sliced tomato and green pepper salad with mayonnaise, fruit, and home-baked cookies, tea, or milk. Wednesday, breakfast is fresh applesauce, prepared cereal, fresh country scrapple, hot biscuits, jam, coffee, or milk. Dinner is Hungarian goulash, parsley potatoes, pickled beets, apple and celery salad, apricots, cookies, coffee, or milk. That's all they provide is just those 3 days. I love that you can see that these menus so heavily are coming from the Victory Gardens. And it's just really cool to see articles like this where they're talking about feeding the harvesters. That was a really big job. And it's so fascinating to see exactly what they were feeding them. That's a really cool part of our American history. So that is it for today's episode. I hope that you enjoyed learning about the American Women's Land Army as much as I did. I went into this knowing pretty much nothing about the Women's Land Army, and now I feel so grateful for how much more I know, and I feel like I am equipped with so much more knowledge to be able to teach other people about it, and I'm really grateful that I had this opportunity to share it with you. If you or your family have American homefront stories, I would love to be able to share them on my podcast. To share your story, go to victorykitchenpodcast.com and click on Share a Homefront Story. We have lots of fun on Instagram, so come on over and give me a follow. My handle is Victory Kitchen Podcast, and I would love your support, which helps keep this podcast going. To do so, go to anchor.fm/Victory Kitchen Podcast and click on support. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye.